All right, let's go ahead and get started, guys. There's a rule, you leave that on always. How is everybody? Good. Welcome to our study. We're going to continue on with the book of Genesis and the study of the Pentateuch and get into another story about Abraham this morning. Just by way of 30-second intro review, every single Sunday we come together, there's always some people here that haven't been to every class, or maybe you're visiting today, and so I have 8-point font script on the board for you guys to squint and read to get yourself caught back up. No, I'll summarize. I guess I'm terrible at building PowerPoint decks. It's just not my forte. We don't do it in the government very often. That's corporate world. All right. Nonetheless, we've already studied Genesis chapters 1 through 11, and in the past couple Sundays we've been going over drilling down into various stories about Abraham, our first patriarch we were introduced to. And so in the beginning we discussed that God created all things. He makes humans in His image, and He gives them a purpose to rule, to subdue the earth, and most of all, this word that comes in is that He blessed them. Okay, He blessed them. And so in God, in the beginning, we immediately see that when man is in alignment with God, when man is in relationship with God, he is blessed. And there's a lot to derive from all that and drill down into, but essentially we have everything we need to flourish. We have everything we need from God to bear His image and to share and partake in to allow creation to flourish, to subdue it, to tend to it, and to essentially be co-rulers with God on this earth. But of course, we know that man rebels. They choose sin, they choose rebellion, and the world spins out of control from there. Men decides to define good and evil for themselves instead of allowing God to define good and evil for them. They choose to go by their own will. And we see what happens when man does that. We already know that, just looking at history. Secularly, just in the world, in our generations and generations recent and generations long past, we see what the world looks like without God. But in Genesis, the microscope is put directly on it, and we see what happens to man when he departs from his holy, loving Creator. What happens when man departs from his purpose that is God-given? Well, you see the world spiral out of control, and what essentially happens is you find man living for themselves. Selfish desires. Everything is about the self. And in Jesus, we learn that everything is about the selfless. It's about others and serving this community of Christians. Okay, and this all leads up to this anticlimax, if you will, in the rebellion at Babel and the scattering of people. And so the question remains, at this point, if you're the reader, if you're new to the Pentateuch, if you're new to Genesis, it's what is God going to do to rescue and redeem His world? Okay, He's got the promise in the garden. Right when man sinned, He immediately comes in with grace and mercy and gives the promise and prophecy of the wounded victor. He prophesies of Jesus coming. He says, there is a seed that is going to come through woman that is going to defeat Satan. How is that going to happen? Well, the Israelites don't know when they're reading Moses' law. And the reader who's new to this is saying, I don't know. There's this suspense. What is God going to do to redeem the world? And so then we enter chapter 12, and we have this promise where immediately you see connected to the origin story of the earth is this man Abraham. And that's important because through Abraham and his genealogy, we're going to trace right up to Christ, and it's going to substantiate and corroborate the purpose of Christ and the prophecy that foretold of His coming. So in this chapter 12, we see the promise of the land, the nation, the great name, and most importantly, the why. Because in you, all the families of the earth will be what? That word again from the garden. You will be blessed. Just like we said, you are going to be given everything you need to flourish in this creation with your true God-given purpose. To be an image bearer of the divine, to be an image bearer of God, and that is to show love to others, to be selfless, to serve. All these things that Jesus did that He illuminated in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? But you will be blessed, and it's going to come through Jesus. And so God's plan is to rescue and bless His rebellious world through Abraham's family. Enter Abraham into the story. And so this is why the rest of Genesis, you'll see, comes to kind of a grinding halt. whereas chapters 1 through 11 is about 2,000 some odd years of history. The rest of the book is just a couple hundred years of history going through Abraham and his sons. But this same motif and this same cycle of lessons we're going to glean over and over again with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. And that is that Abraham and his sons must learn that the great promise must be fulfilled divinely and miraculously or not at all. And so when we read about Abraham and Sarah in Egypt with Pharaoh, when we read about Abraham and Sarah receiving the promise of a son, when we read about Abraham in this test we're going to talk about today with Isaac, the idea is he is teaching him over and over and over again that this promise that I gave to you in chapter 12 and reiterated thereafter, this covenant must be fulfilled divinely and miraculously or not at all. And I think what we're going to learn today is, and I think it's obvious, but the point needs to be made that this lesson is for us as well. Everything that Abraham needs to learn about this great promise and its divine, miraculous fulfillment is a lesson for us. We have to know this in our lives. Okay, so turn with me in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 22. Genesis chapter 22. We kind of come to the climax of Abraham's story, this culmination of learning that he's been doing. He's been in he's been maturing through lesson and lesson and lesson that God has been giving him, and we see this we see this culmination of his maturation here in chapter 22, if you will. Let's read verse 1. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. I want to stop there. We're going to read verses 1 through 19, but I want to stop there and just ask you, what does it mean to be tested by God? You do have a microphone. Do you want this one? It doesn't matter? Okay. What does it mean to be tested by God? Proved, Leah Foy says. Sorry, I'm in front of you. Okay, Leah Foy says proved. What else does it mean to be tested by God?
Well, I think that's it. The word temptation literally means test or trial, and what we're doing when we're tested is to prove our faith. And in the proof of our faith, it brings God's approval.
Test, trial, to prove our faith, which then brings God's approval. Okay, what else? Any other thoughts? We can't be rescued without testing. You want to expound on that?
If we're not tested or prove our faith to Him, we have no option for rescue. Why would we want it? Why would we seek it? And I think especially we see this over and over with Abraham, because he's our father, he's the father of man, but not in God's father. But I think you understand my point. But I just think, just the word rescue just reverberates with me.
That resonates with me, and I think this is reiterating your point. But one thing that struck me as I read this story of Abraham is this idea of this test, and this idea that when things are good in your life, when there is no trial, when there is no test, it's very easy to do the right thing, right? There's an argument for that, and we can compartmentalize that, but the idea here is where you prove your faith is when you're pressed. When you're pressed. When you have every reason not to. When you have every reason to doubt. Now, that doesn't negate the fact that when things are good, you have all these things that come in that distract you, that lead you in a direction of your own doubt, that's of your own will. But when things are bad, when you're in trials, that's when you're being tested and proved. So we're going to move through the next point because we're going to explore this throughout this class. James 1:13 talks about God doesn't tempt. He says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. And so I draw your attention to 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 5 through 7, which says, who are protected by the power of God through faith for our salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials, so that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in the praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Okay, so are we also tested, and if so, how? I think we'll explore that as we go through the class. We don't need to answer that now. Are we also tested, and if so, how? When we read the story of Abraham, are we tested in a similar fashion to Abraham? Okay. So this next slide is a video that kind of explores this idea of a test. It's about 6 minutes long. Let's go ahead and watch this together, and then we'll have a conversation.
The story of the Bible begins with God creating a beautiful world and then sharing it with all of his creatures.
And he appoints Adam and Eve to rule it on his behalf.
And God gives them access to his wisdom and life, but then tells them that there's one tree they can't eat from because it will lead to death.
So they have a choice about how to rule with God. This kind of feels like a test.
Well, that's because it is a test.
But isn't that kind of cruel for God to test them?
Well, not all tests are bad. Let's say there's a king who chooses you to fulfill a royal task because he wants to know if you are trustworthy.
Well, I guess that's a test, but really it's an opportunity to do something important and noble.
Right, but then let's say there's a rebel who hates the king and you, and he tries to convince you that you would be better off not doing what the king asks.
Well, the rebel is setting a trap.
Right, so a test could be an opportunity or a trap. And the difference is whether the one testing you has your best interests in mind.
I see. And both types of tests appear in the beginning of the Bible. God tells them to eat of the tree of life and not the forbidden tree.
Yeah, this is God's test of loyalty. God wants to rule the world with humans as his partners, which means they will need to trust his wisdom over their own.
But then a rebel comes and tests them to eat of that other tree.
Right, the rebel seizes this opportunity and twists it, so he can lead the humans into exile and ultimately death.
He turns the test into a trap.
But after the humans fail, God promises that one day a human will come who will pass the test and defeat the snake. And as the story moves on, God gives a couple named Abraham and Sarah an opportunity to trust him by leaving their family behind, to go to a new land where God will use them to restore his blessing to all people.
So this is a test.
And at first, things go well. But Abraham quickly fails. He lies to protect himself, and then he and Sarah scheme to get a son their own way by abusing one of their servants.
Definitely not passing the test.
But God doesn't give up on Abraham. He gives him one final opportunity, a test to prove his loyalty. God asks Abraham to go up onto a hill and offer his son as a sacrifice.
I can't imagine a more intense test.
And Abraham does it. But in the last moment, God stops him and provides a substitute animal in the place of his son. God then says he will fulfill his promise through Abraham's family because he passed this test.
So Abraham passed this test, but he hasn't proven to be a fully trustworthy partner. We're still waiting for someone who can pass the ultimate test.
Yeah, and as the family of Abraham grows and becomes a nation, God continues to test them.
Like when the Israelites wander in the wilderness for 40 years.
They have lots of opportunities to trust in God, to provide water or daily bread.
But they instead blame God and even say that he trapped them in the desert to kill them.
And so the rest of Israel's story in the Hebrew Scriptures is pretty much the same. The Israelites don't trust in God and his promise. They're not loyal, and eventually the whole nation fails.
So humans have an amazing opportunity to partner with God, but no one is really qualified.
And so all of this brings us forward to Jesus. There's a story where Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights without food or water.
Ah, yes, the wilderness. And there, he meets a sinister creature who tries to trap him.
But Jesus trusts in God's wisdom.
And he passes the test.
Then later there's a story about Jesus going to pray with some friends, and God commissions him to go up to Jerusalem and to give up his life.
And so he goes. And on the night of his arrest, Jesus took his friends and went to a garden.
And he told them to pray because tonight, he said, is the great test.
And he prayed to God, please let this test pass from me, but not my desire, rather may your desire be done.
In this garden, Jesus shows us what passing the test looks like. He trusted in God's wisdom, he loved others more than himself, and he confronted evil with good.
Even though it cost him his life.
Right. Jesus offered his own life as a sacrifice to cover for all of the failed tests of his people Israel and of all humanity. Jesus passed the ultimate test on behalf of us all.
This is amazing. But that doesn't mean everything is gonna be great in our lives. I mean, let's be honest, we're gonna face our own tests every day.
Right. Jesus said every generation of his followers would have their own tests that will force them to trust God in radical new ways.
And these tests can be difficult and often painful.
But remember, a test from a good God is an opportunity. This is why James, a leader in the early Jesus movement, said that we should be grateful when we face tests and trials because they offer us a gift. It's an opportunity to surrender to God's wisdom and to become more like Jesus, the one who loved us and who passed the test on our behalf.
Okay. So we're going to talk about this idea of this test and what it means in our lives, and maybe something was said in that video kind of inspired and will guide maybe our discussion here about the test of Abraham and what it means in the grand scheme of things and his maturing as a Christian and what it means in our individual lives. If I could get somebody to read Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 19, we'll dive into the text here. Michael, if you're willing to.
Okay. Genesis 22, starting in verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went, both of them together, and Isaac said to his father Abraham, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. He said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide, as it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba.
Thank you. Okay, what words would you guys use to describe Abraham's response to God's test? Faith. Obedience. Obedience. Trust. Faith, obedience, trust. Anything else? I think that's this idea of this test is every time we are tested and when we see Abraham tested, this is that opportunity that video talked about. It's an opportunity to demonstrate your faith in action. It's an opportunity to demonstrate your trust, just like Adam and Eve had that opportunity in the garden. It's an opportunity to demonstrate that trust, just like Noah had when he built the ark. It's an opportunity to demonstrate that trust, just like Cain and Abel had when they were offering sacrifices. And in our lives, we have that same opportunity to do the same thing. And so here we see this beautiful example, this beautiful story that, by the way, just as a narrative, kind of sounds different than the rest of Genesis thus far, right? Even the way this story and the cadence of this story goes, it's interesting. There's details here that you don't really see elsewhere, whereas there's like a macro view of a story. This one drills down and is going almost minute by minute through what Abraham is doing. So it starts here, it's like twist the proverbial knife in the emotional aspect of this story, where it says in chapter 22, verse 2, it says, "Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac." And it drills down how important and how significant this is. It gives three imperatives. Take Isaac, go, and offer him as a burnt offering. And there's no indication that he was given any other instruction besides this. Which, to the reader reading this, it seems like an outlandish request, you may say. But what we see Abraham do and how he responds is a lesson for us in our own lives. You see these seemingly perfunctory details of Abraham's preparation. You see, verse 3, he rose early. He saddled his donkey. He took 2 young men. He cut wood. I said seemingly perfunctory or ordinary or routine because we later see what a foreshadowing these details are of things to come. But this idea is to draw you into this story and see it from Abraham's perspective. As a reader, we already know that this is a test from the beginning. But Abraham doesn't know that. He just has been told to do something. So we're seeing it from his eyes how he's going to respond. And the expectation is that Isaac is to be given back without reservations of any sort. And this is a motif that repeats throughout the rest of the Old Testament and then is fulfilled in Jesus, this idea of firstborn males belonging to the Lord. We see in Exodus chapter 13, verse 11, when the Israelites enter the promised land, it says, "Firstborn males belong to the Lord. Now when the Lord brings you to the land of the Canaanite, as he swore to you and your fathers and gives it to you, you shall devote to the Lord the first offspring of every womb and the first offspring of every beast that you own." So this idea is Abraham is actually giving back to God that which is his. And it's interesting here. There's no arguing. There's no how could you. There's no why would he. There's no this is not fair. There is no this is unjust. It is simply this is what God has asked me to do. Okay, and it wasn't enough that he had to resign himself to Isaac's death. He had to build the fire. He had to bind the boy. He had to raise the knife. He had to look into his eyes, and he had to plunge the knife into him and make this sacrifice to God. He didn't just have to suffer the loss. He was compelled to carry out the process. Okay, so as you're reading this, when I read it alone in my own study, it's a very emotional story. There's not much dialogue. And even that first question that Isaac brings up after they're already 3 days into their journey, and he says, "My father." And then Abraham says, "Here I am, my son." This is a very emotional story and interaction between Isaac and Abraham. So, Yes, sir.
Your phrase, the son given to Abraham was to be given back to God without reservations of any sort. That's an interesting phrasing. Does that mean that Abraham didn't have doubts? Abraham wasn't saying to himself, I don't understand, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. He didn't verbally express that, but to say that without reservation, that almost goes against what man normally goes through. Your doubts, your fears, your longings to understand, all that type of stuff. That's a big bar to live up to.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that is really just because we don't know what was in Abraham's mind, if it's really fair to say he didn't have reservations of any sort.
Yeah, I think wording is important, and I don't want to detract from the point from making it in this way. But internal anguish, I don't think is mutually exclusive from not having any reservations. He can be internally in turmoil about this process, but the idea, I guess, that I was trying to make is that at this apex of his faith, as he's matured and come along and learned to trust in God through the birth of his son, the promise of his son, and all this, the idea is spiritually, I move forward in trust. Without reservation spiritually in God. So much trust that you make that leap, that you do it, that you obey. Now, the internal anguish about what's happening in sorrow, I think, is there. But I don't want to detract from the point from stating definitively that. Reservation, sure, there quite possibly was doubt. Terry?
Abraham, and in fact the book of Hebrews actually completes the thought, not locks it in, that Abraham thought that in fact if he killed Isaac, Isaac would be raised from the dead. If you read the Hebrews point on that one.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Actually, you're one slide ahead of me, Terry. And that's a point I'm coming to. Thank you so much. Let me ask this question. How does Abraham, in the story we just read, demonstrate obedience and trust in God's command? What are some quick examples that you see immediately? I'll give you the first one I said. His response was immediate. You see on verse 3, he says he rose early in the morning. So we see these brief, terse details. Take your son, go, offer him. Abraham rose early in the morning. He's going to do it. What else do you see as exemplary of his obedience and trust? He didn't question. Okay, that's my next one. His response was silent. Okay, you think back to his with Ishmael. He pleaded with God that Ishmael would be the one. And God says he's not. It's going to be Isaac, and Isaac is still to come. And so this idea of maybe the commentary would phrase it, the bargainer went quiet. Abraham is quiet here, and I think that's intentional, and that's exemplary of his obedience and trust. Even the bargaining with Lot, do you remember him standing outside Sodom and Gomorrah and says, would you save it on account of this number of people? Would you save it on account of this number of people? It's like this bargaining, this questioning of God. Not in and of itself bad, and there's a lesson that you can glean from the way that is written as well, the way that event occurred. But here, he was silent. He moved on. He showed a commitment to God's will. I think the time that elapses is exemplary of that. The idea, it says 3 days later, some 3-day journey to get to where he needed to go. And so many men can do great things in the heat of passion or the heat of the battle. They can stand up and be brave. And here's this idea that Abraham has this methodical approach in his mind as he marches forward. He had time to back out, but he was committed to the will of God. You see it with his response to Isaac, God will provide a lamb. And then you hear him, this is to Terry's point, he says to the two men, we will return and worship with you. Stay here, we're going to return and worship with you. So even then, it doesn't spell out what's fulfilled and shown in Hebrews, like Terry said, but it alludes to it, the faith that Abraham had. We're going to return and worship with you, but I'm going up to offer up my son. And so, why did he say we? Let's make Terry's point a little clearer. Hebrews 11, verse 17 through 19. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, "In Isaac your descendant shall be called." He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. So why did Abraham walk confidently to the altar of sacrifice with his son? Isaac would live. And maybe that's what I can't tell if you were impugning the point that I make or you were expounding upon it, but I will say the no reservations thing, I don't want to get lost in the weeds on that, on the turmoil and anguish and inner dialogue that Abraham must have had. But this idea of this faith that's so resolute, he believed that Isaac would be raised from the dead. And so this is back to one of our class theses. Abraham must learn that the great promise must be fulfilled divinely and miraculously or not at all. And one could argue that previous to this, he didn't get it. He didn't get it yet. But in this story, it would be hard not to argue he got it. He will come back. All right, so this is an important point. If we ran out of time and only made this point and ended here, I would be happy because I just really like this point. Can you relate to situations in your life where obedience to God's will requires a similar great trust? Or maybe I don't want to ruin the question by similar. Just generally, can you relate to where obedience to God's will requires your obedience and trust in a similar fashion? Brian says all the time. How? That's all I want. I'm just kidding.
We're constantly tested in this life, and you put your trust into God. How can I say your mother? The difficulties that she faces. I just trust God has a purpose in what we're undergoing with her health conditions. I pray constantly for her recovery, but in 18 years it hasn't happened. But I trust God has a reason for that which we're going through.
Okay. So what Brian talks about is his wife, my mother, her health problems. Everybody in this room has family, or they themselves are enduring health problems. That's one trial or tribulation you have, where within that you can show a mental fortitude and spiritual strength to remain faithful to God, a proving of your faith through that. And so just to go drilled right down to the point that I'm making, that's right, all the trials, and you can expound upon all the myriad of anecdotes, as you said. So the point that I'll make is that where we can relate to Abraham's story about a time to show great obedience and trust isn't far off to exactly what Abraham had to do. It's not just like near parallel. Spiritually, we have to walk the same path that he did, and that's what this story is revealed to be foreshadowing in the New Testament in Jesus. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 24, it says, "Then Jesus said to his disciples, 'Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me.'" So I talked about this with Rick, and he illuminated this. It must have been months ago or years ago, but that point stuck with me, is this idea of, he asked me, what does it mean to pick up your cross? What are you doing when you pick up your cross to follow Christ? Bearing a burden, but it's more than that. What does it mean to pick up a cross? You are picking up your cross and marching to your death. You're saddling yourself with the kindling of your death. You are going to pick up your cross and you are going to walk. And so you have to, okay, I got to pick up my cross and follow. I've got to, you really have to take it to its necessary end. I am trusting in God that as I march forward to die, Philippians 3, verse 10 says, that I may know him in the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death, in order that I may attain the resurrection from the dead. And so just like Abraham, he marched confidently to that hill with the wood, with the fire, with the flint to start the fire. Why? Because like Terry says, he believed that God was going to bring Isaac back. And we do the exact same thing. We march to our death, to die, knowing that when we're buried with Christ in baptism and come up, we will be buried with Christ and resurrected with him. So you have to have that obedience and trust to be risen anew. Romans 6:4 says, "We were therefore buried with him through baptism and death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, we too may have a new life." So the same thing. We have to trust, just like Abraham trusts. And just like this point we keep making, we have to believe and know that this promise in our lives some 2,000 years after Christ is just going to be fulfilled miraculously through Jesus Christ or not at all. There's no other way. And there's sort of something refreshing about that you can just fall back into. You need Jesus Christ, and he will save you from your sins. Okay. Any comments on that? The unwavering faith in the resurrection. So that's why I think he was certainly forlorn about what the task was in front of him, but he had this fortitude to bring him 3 days' journey to this mountain. Okay, to offer his son. All right, so how does this story foreshadow God's plan for redemption through Christ? There are many examples. Let's just take a few minutes, maybe look over the passage yourself. It's just a few short verses, and mark every example you can see that is a foreshadowing of Christ. You can talk amongst yourselves, you can talk to your neighbor, write it down with a pencil. Think just for a few moments, I'll give you a chance to kind of look over and write down every example you can see in the passage that is a foreshadowing of our redemption in Christ. It's just fascinating that this is the law of Moses. This is the book of Moses. This was written for the Israelites. So much of this for so many thousands of years, well, a couple thousand, was unknown to the Israelites. It was unknown to them about how it would be fulfilled. So just take a few minutes to do that. Genesis 22, verses 1 through, I guess not 19. Well, it could be 1 through 19. Right, yeah. It's the narrative of the test of Abraham and the sacrificing of Isaac. What are the examples peppered throughout this passage that foreshadow Jesus? I have 8. There's probably more. Most certainly there's more. Okay, let's talk about this. Raise your hand and let's start talking about some of these foreshadowings of Jesus. Which ones do you see? There's the first spell. So we got about 5 minutes to talk about it. Brian?
The promised son.
Only son. Genesis 22:2. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love." John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son." So there's one type. What else? I'll give one tandem to that. He was the son of promise. Although one could argue that's outside of 1 through 19 of 22. But Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. Likewise, Jesus was a son of promise. Okay, and then dad, only son, was the one that you said. God had never asked for any humans to be sacrificed. Yeah, that's an interesting point. And then, obviously, we know the fulfillment in Jesus in the end. Okay? What else? He took the wood. That's right, the kindling. So Genesis 22:6 says, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, so the two of them walked on together. And then obviously we know John chapter 19:17, carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which is called Golgotha. So it's so cool about this story in the Pentateuch, so early on in the narrative, and there's all these parallels to the events that transpire leading up to Jesus' death. Brian? Abraham said that God would provide a sacrifice. That's right. So this idea of a substitute sacrifice. Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him, a ram. Romans 5:8, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were sinners, Christ died for us. So there's a substitute. Michael?
It says that he bound Isaac. Maybe they bound Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, I
No.
guess,
Yeah.
Here's maybe they're both a stretch, but hey, since you asked, and I'm thinking, Isaac asks, where is the lamb? That question, I don't know, it reminds me of Revelation, like, there's the lamb, but, when we're here on earth, or maybe before Christ came, where's the lamb? But even now, where's the lamb? We're waiting on
John
his
the
return.
Baptist, who said, behold the lamb.
Behold
so it's like
the
the
lamb.
answer to the question, where is the lamb? Behold the lamb. Yep. There was a willing sacrifice. Genesis 22, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son, and the two of them went on together. So there's a lot to be said about even the faith of Isaac in this situation, is that he went. And this, I don't imagine that Abraham had to force him and wrestle him onto the altar. There's this idea of him willingly submitting to this will as well. Philippians 2:8 says, and being found in appearance as man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross. And so Jesus is a willing sacrifice. Also, this idea of going to Mount Moriah. He says in verse 2, go to this land, go to this mount where I'll show you, go to this land of Moriah. Moriah is mentioned another time in the Pentateuch, or not the Pentateuch, sorry, the Old Testament in 2 Chronicles. It says, then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. And so one could conclude that this is the same site where Isaac was offered, where the temple was built, and then obviously Jerusalem is built on Mount Moriah there. And so Jesus was crucified near the place where this occurred. So geographically, we have this echo throughout time towards the fulfillment. Carrying the wood was one. This other one, the two men accompany. There were two thieves on the cross. And I don't believe that's a stretch when you go through here. What perfunctory details were provided in the beginning when Abraham started preparing for his journey? He saddled his donkey? Why do I need to know that? All of Genesis 1 through 11 is telling me this sweeping story, and here we come down to the grinding details. He saddled his donkey. He took two men. He loaded the wood. He carried it here. This is all foreshadowing of what's to come. Substitute sacrifice. The ram caught in the thicket, the thorns, the crown of thorns on Jesus' head. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's interesting that it was a 3-day journey for Abraham.
The 3-day
and it was
journey.
a 3-day journey before Jesus was arisen.
Yeah.
And also, if we read, like we're talking about how Abraham truly believed that Isaac would come back, that God would raise him from the dead, that did happen with Jesus, is that he did come back as well.
That's right. Exactly. And so this is a beautiful testament to faith, our relationship with God, and the trust that we should have in him. And we have to have the same faith that Abraham had, to step forward, carry our kindling, carry our cross, die with Jesus, knowing we only do that because he's given us every reason to trust that we'll be resurrected with him, just like Abraham had. Okay, that's the lesson. Thanks, guys.